looked upon and our hands have handled concerning the word of life. That's Jesus. The life was manifested, and we have seen and bear witness and declare to you that eternal life, which was with the Father and was manifested, that means make known, was manifested to us. That which we have seen and heard, we declare to you, that you also may have fellowship with us. And truly our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. John says, we heard it, we saw it, we touched him. John was there. So when you're reading the Gospel of John, you're not reading a second or third-hand account. You're reading the account of someone who was there with Jesus in a very close way. Makes an important and unique nature of the Gospel. The purpose of the book. What's John all about? It is very clear. You do not have to guess the answer to this question. What's John all about? He tells us. It's to cause belief in Jesus as the Son of God. It is a book designed to create belief and faith in its readers. The passage is from John chapter 20 that makes this so clear. The next to last chapter, there are 21 chapters in the Gospel of John. At the end of chapter 20, John says this, and truly Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. The signs were the miracles of Jesus. This is a word that John uses regularly to refer to the miracles, the miraculous supernatural actions that Jesus as the Son of God was able to perform. There are 7 of them recorded in the Gospel of John. They're called signs. And here he says he did a lot of other signs, which are not written in this book. But I've written these for you that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. The purpose of the book is to inspire belief in Jesus. So, you see several places where John is asserting the deity of Jesus Christ. This is the purpose of the book. Let's test our memory here just a little bit. From chapter 1 and verse 1, John will say, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and, fill in the blanks with me, the Word was God. The Word was God. It's very simple. John's writing, the scholars tell us that his Greek, the Greek he uses, is some of the simplest in the New Testament. And in some ways it comes across in the English. He just says it. You don't have to guess what John's trying to tell us. I was there. I saw it. I heard it. I felt him. And I'm telling you, he is the Son of God. Chapter 1, verse 1. Right, you just start it right off. He says, the Word was God. And we'll talk about his use of the word word in just a moment. When he says word, he's referring to Jesus. Chapter 1 and verse 34, John the Baptist, who is a witness of Jesus, declared, this is the Son of God. This is the Son of God. Chapter 8 and verse 58, Jesus himself in a fascinating defense and proclamation of his deity before the Jewish leaders, said, remember this one? Before Abraham, right, their father, the one they revered so much, before Abraham was born, I am. A-M. I am. Chapter 8 and verse 58. The I am statement refers back to Exodus 3 and verse 14. Well, I'm jumping ahead of myself. I'll get that in just a second, okay? But 858, Jesus uses the same language that God uses before Moses, before the burning bush. When he says, what's my name? My name is I am. Jesus uses the same name. He appropriates the name of God. Before Abraham was born, I am, asserting his deity. In chapter 10 and verse 30, Jesus says, I and my Father are one. I and the Father are one. Proclaiming and asserting his deity. Jesus says in chapter 14 and verse 9, he who has seen me has seen the Father. You've seen me, you've seen God. You don't have to guess what the purpose of this book is. These are clear, direct proclamations, clear, direct assertions that Jesus Christ of Nazareth was the Son of God. Now the question is, do we believe it or not with those statements? Okay, you can't say, well, I didn't quite understand it, so I didn't respond to it. You can't read John and walk away saying, I don't understand this. You got to make a decision about what you're going to do with that information. Understanding it is pretty clear. And there's another one. Chapter 20 and verse 28, Jesus says, no, this is not Jesus. This is Thomas. Thomas the apostle, right? Doubting Thomas. When he saw Jesus, he had been told that Jesus had been resurrected, right? But he didn't believe it. I want to see it. But when he saw it, and when he touched him, right, he saw his side, and he saw the prints in his hands. It was Thomas that said what? My Lord and my God. My Lord and my God. And he worshiped him. The chronology of the book is interesting. It can be a little frustrating, and so it's important to understand this going into your reading and studying of the gospel. Okay? The first 12 chapters of John cover select events, certainly not every event, select events from about 3-year period. And this is basically from the earthly ministry of Jesus, his public ministry, okay, which was about 3 years. John 1 through John 12 contains events from that period of time. Just the first 12 chapters, okay? Chapters 13 through 21, there's a clear division point. Okay, it's chronological, but in the way John is recording, okay? First 12 chapters, he's selecting events from the public ministry of Jesus. 13 through 21 records events that occur in about a week's worth of time. Okay? So 13 through 21 are very condensed. A lot of material describing the about 1 week period of time. Okay? Chapters 13 through 19 themselves are just the betrayal night and the day of Jesus' crucifixion. Okay? A lot of which is made up of his discourse with his apostles in the upper room as they were partaking of the Last Supper. Okay? And then his prayer in the garden in chapter 17. Okay, so when you get to 13, things really slow down. Okay, and you have a lot of material about a relatively short period of time. This intrigues me. Every time I see this, this intrigues me. The total number of days referenced in the Gospel of John, events from certain days, from that 3-year public ministry of Jesus, 20. Some writers say maybe 30. Either way you go, it's only a very short total period of time that John is writing about. Out of a 3-year public ministry, you get about 20 days from that period of Jesus' life. John 21 and verse 25 then makes a lot of sense in that context. The very last verse of John's gospel says this, and there are also many other things that Jesus did, which, if they were written one by one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. Now, maybe that's a little bit of hyperbole, but John is making the point, and we should understand the point, that Jesus was the Son of God. He was extraordinary in his life. His life was filled with signs and wonders and miracles and interaction with people that showed that he was different. He was not just a man. He was not just a teacher. He was not just a good man. He was, in fact, deity. He was the Son of God. And he deserves our belief, not just our respect for someone who started a religion and was a good teacher. He deserves more than that. He deserves our worship, our praise, our very lives in following him. That's what this book is all about. Now, with that as a beginning, let's think about a couple of key highlights that we'll see in the book. And the grouping here, I think, is not accidental. First, and I think I made reference to this earlier, there are 7 signs of Jesus. Just 7. You get 7 miracles, 7 signs recording in the Gospel of John. The Greek word for sign means a distinguishing mark. And the context clearly is talking about supernatural activity that Jesus inspired. First, we'll see that he changes water into wine or grape juice. We'll talk about that distinction in chapter 2. Chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, he shows himself to be the master of quality. What he produced from water was the very best. He controlled the quality of what he was doing. He heals a nobleman's son in chapter 4. He's not present when the boy is healed. But the nobleman learns when he returns home that the boy became well at the very time Jesus said he would become well. Jesus was a master of space. He's deity. He's not controlled by space. He doesn't have to be present to do something. And that's exhibited in chapter 4. In chapter 5, he heals a crippled man. This man had been crippled for 38 years. Jesus is a master of time. It doesn't matter that the man was crippled for 38 years. We know when someone is diseased or crippled, the longer you go, the harder it is to fix it, right? That's of no relevance to Jesus in chapter 5. He's the master of time as he heals this crippled man. He feeds the 5,000 in chapter 6. It's 5,000 men, the text says, so probably a lot more. He shows himself there to be the master of quantity because he did it with what? 2 fish and 5 little loaves. That's all he needed. He's the master of quantity. He could feed thousands from that small amount because he's deity. No one else can do that. He controls the quantity of that substance. In chapter 6, he's recorded as walking on the water in the midst of a storm. He's the master of nature. He created it. We're going to see in verse 3 of chapter 1. He controls it. He's the master of that. And in fact, the winds and the waves do what? Obey his will. In chapter 9, he heals a blind man. This man had been blind from birth. A terrible misfortune. Nothing that he did to himself. Jesus is the master of misfortune. And then finally, number 7 in chapter 11, he raises Lazarus from the dead. The ultimate misfortune, death. Jesus is the master of that. So look at what you have when you follow Jesus. You're following someone who's the master of quality, the master of space, time, quantity, nature, misfortune, and death. These are the things that plague us as mere human beings. Jesus is the master of those. He is truly the Son of God. 7 signs. Now, John wrote the Gospel of John, and he wrote Revelation. Remember when we studied Revelation? The 7 means something? Okay, this is not coincidental that there are 7 signs recorded, I think, in the Gospel of John. 7 represents what? What's the number 7? It's the complete and perfect number. Okay, perfect. John just says, I give you 7. It's a perfect representation of the supernatural ability of Jesus. And so having 7 meant something to these readers, these initial readers, maybe more so than it does to us, even though we understand from our studies what it means. It is similar to what you see in Revelation, where the number 7 carries that same significance. So it shouldn't surprise us then that the second big highlight of the book, as you read through, you will see 7 I am statements. These are metaphors that Jesus uses to describe himself. I am the bread of life, chapter 6. I am the light of the world, Jesus says in chapter 8. I am the door of the sheep, chapter 10. I am the good shepherd, chapter 10. I am the resurrection and the life, chapter 11. I am the way, the truth, and the life, chapter 14. I am the true vine, chapter 15 and verse 1. The 7 famous I am statements, or I am metaphors. Again, 7 being a perfect representative number. When John uses 7, he picks out 7. It's not random. There's a reason for it. So 2 great highlights that you'll see in the book. The 7 signs and the 7 I am statements. Now, I am talking a lot. Would anybody like to say anything about this introductory material? I want to get into the book, but this is really important. All this lays a very important groundwork for studying the Gospel of John. Sandy. focusing on his deity, right? His eternal existence. That's right. Sandy makes the point each of the Gospels had an intended audience and an intended theme, and we see this theme very clearly, and the audience is universal. Okay, John's writing to all those who need to believe in Jesus, which is every person. Good. Any other comments here about this introductory material? Okay, let's look at the text itself as we get started. There is, in the beginning here of the Gospel of John, a very extended prologue of about 18 verses. Notice it's a very different start to the Gospel than what you have in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Extremely different. Okay, no genealogies, no discussion about Jesus as a baby or his birth or as a young man. Okay, John is topical, and he's going to tell us in the first 18 verses big, important themes that he wants to be proving about Jesus and his deity. Let's break it down. Let's read 1 through 13. Okay, let's start 1 through 13. I don't want to do all of 18 in a reading. Let's do 1 through 13, and then we'll stop and go back. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. Verse 6, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. This man came for a witness to bear witness of the light, that all through him might believe. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which gives light to every man coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. In the beginning. Where have we seen that before? There's a direct connection here with Genesis 1 and 1, the beginning of the Bible. John uses the same phrase that Moses used. In the beginning. In the beginning of time. The creation of the universe. In the beginning, John says, there was the Word. Now, notice the word here, was. Sometimes in our Bible study, it's the smallest little words that can have the most significant meaning. And let me say to you, you got one right here. And if you're somebody that likes to write in your Bible, and I would encourage you to write in your Bible, okay, circle the word was, because it's a really important word. The Greek word here, translated was, means eternally existing. In the beginning was the Word. Was means no start and no end. It's just existence. Now, that's what the Greek word here translated means. Now, to really understand this, do a little compare and contrasting. Okay? Contrast this with verse 6, which we read. Okay? Verse 6 says what? There was a man sent from God whose name was John. Now, that's not John our writer, okay? That's John the baptizer, right? The witness to Jesus, the forerunner, okay? In verse 6, he's talking about John the Baptist. The English word was is in verse 6. Okay, circle that one too. And draw a line between the two. And make a note, they're not the same Greek word. What about that? The English word's the same, so you would think they would be the same. They're not the same. It's a different Greek word. The word here describing John is a different Greek word, which means to come to be. There's a starting point in time. John, the baptizer, was born, right? He came to be at a certain time. There was a man named John, there was a point in time where he became a man, was born. That's not the word in verse 1. When John refers to Jesus, he says, in the beginning, there was the Word. Was is eternally existing. It's a different word. Now compare that to chapter 8 and verse 58. This is where I almost jumped ahead earlier. Okay, Jesus, in referring to himself in chapter 8 and defending that he was the Son of God, he says, before Abraham was born, I am. I am. That's 8:58. The word, the Greek word there translated I am, guess what it is? It's the same word translated was in chapter 1 and verse 1. It's the same word. Before Abraham was born, I am. Same word that we have here in chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word. They are different in 1 and 6. They are the same in chapter 8 and verse 58. Dennis. Yes, yes. And there are some different translations that try to add other English words here to help this understand. But I want all of us to know these are not the same words in 1 and 6. Referring to Jesus, it's an eternally existence word. That's what the Greek word means. Referring to John the Baptist, there's a starting point in time. Because John was a man, and Jesus, the Word, was deity. Eternally existing. That's what the Greek word means. Sandy. Okay. Okay. He came into existence. Very good. Very good. The Word. In the beginning was the Word. John uses the Greek word logos, L-O-G-O-S, which is translated word. We're very familiar with this word. Okay, we use the word word. What is a word? Think about this in a simple way. A word is, and I think it's Guy and Wood that uses this phrase that I picked up here on the slide, a vessel. It's a vessel that carries or conveys communication. It expresses some inner thought, right? We use words as vessels of communication, oral communication to express, or written communication to express thoughts. John uses the word logos to talk about Jesus as communication, as the expression of the thought that he is a complete and full statement of deity. He carries with him the fact that he is from God. He is God. He was with God from the beginning. He was not created. He is the Logos. And when you have Jesus, you have this expression, this communication of this deep and moving, life-changing thought that I'm dealing here with the Son of God, not just with a good teacher, not just with a good man. It is Logos. It is the Word. In the beginning was the Word. It's a fascinating use of the language by the Apostle John. He is the complete and full revelation of deity. And I have a number of verses here. We don't have time to look at them. But think particularly in Colossians. Colossians talks about, in Colossians, Paul talks about Jesus being the fullness of the Godhead in bodily form. There's nothing missing in Jesus. When you have Jesus, you have all of deity. You have all of the Godhead in bodily form, manifested in the body as Jesus. That's verse 14, which we haven't read yet. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And even today, in 2018, we all have to think about what that means to us. Do we believe that or do we reject that? And what are the consequences of our belief or our rejection? Now let's keep going as we have just a little more time. The Word and creation, verses 3 through 5. John affirms a Bible truth, which is a foundation of our tenet of Christian faith. And sometimes we don't talk about it enough. He says that through the Word, all things were what? Made. All things were made. Jesus was in the beginning with God, and he was part of the creation. He was the agency through whom God, the Father, created everything, all things. And the word here translated, all things, means each separate item. Each separate item were made through him. Genesis 1:26, let us, remember the plural that's used there in Genesis 1? Let us make man in our, plural, our image. It's the Father and the Son and the Spirit, all three there. That's the reference. In Hebrews 1 and verse 2, Colossians 1 and verse 16, 1 Corinthians 8 and verse 6, all affirm this point, that Jesus was the agent of creation. And in fact, he still holds it all together, Paul says in Colossians 1. Through him all things consist, is what Paul says. And that means literally holds together. He made it. And he continues even today to hold it together. When you affirm your belief in Jesus Christ, you're affirming your belief in the Creator and the one who controls and still holds together all of the natural world. He didn't just make it and walk away from it. He still continues to hold it together. All things consist because of him. This tremendous affirmation here of the deity of Jesus Christ. He is life. Well, we understand what life is, right? Life is existence. It's the source of being. It's the power to sustain. And there's the Colossians 1, excuse me, and verse 17 reference. The power to sustain. All things still consist or hold together through him. He is the light. Light is the source of illumination. It dispels spiritual darkness. It fights Satan. Satan wants darkness, but Jesus is the light. He is the one who illuminates. And then we'll talk next week as we begin in verse 6 about John the baptizer, not our author, but John the baptizer, who is a witness, who came first to proclaim the way for the King Jesus to come. Thank you for being here. We'll continue to study chapter 1 and finish it next week and try to get into chapter 2. So do be reading ahead as we're studying this gospel together. Thank you very much for being here today.